Hello and welcome to the Swinging Christies, the podcast about Agatha Christie in the swinging 60s. My name's Dr. Mark Aldridge. I'm an associate professor and I write and research about Agatha Christie an awful lot, including in my book, Agatha Christie's Poirot, the greatest detective in the world.
And I'm Gray Robert Brown, and I'm a writer and a Christie buff. Not as in I'm buff, but as in I'm a big fan of hers, is what I mean to say.
Talking of buff.
What a segue. So, love, marriage, gender, sexuality, queerness. This week, the big topic in question is sex.
You're trying to seduce me. Aren't you?
Mark Aldridge, Dr. Mark Aldridge. Why are we leading with this as episode 1?
Well, it's such a big topic, and I think that we really wanted to open with this one. We were having discussion about the whole podcast because this is the sort of thing that people don't associate with Agatha Christie.
Yes.
And it kept popping up time and time again. I mean, it does anyway, but especially in her 60s stuff. And what I think is really interesting is that the way she talks about sex is not necessarily the way you expect her to. And I think that there are ways that you think she's going to talk about its role in relationships, its role in society.
Or as a motive for a crime, which we do get a lot, but
not exclusively, because
No.
that's what I think a lot of people would think. But actually, it's discussed a lot more casually than that, really frequently. It's just another part of society.
often non-judgmentally, I would argue, but often quite matter-of-factly and definitely consistently. And it's very much in line with what's going on in the decade generally.
Because this is the important thing, isn't it? So we've got Agatha Christie writing about the 1960s in the 1960s. And she may not have been right in the midst of the most swinging parts of society, but she was always interested. She always wanted to know. And this goes back really to her earliest works, the idea that she wanted to know about other people. She was curious. And in the 60s, these are such radical changes. And we'll see as we go through that she isn't always fully accepting of the way that society changes in the 60s. But she does recognise that that's because if you're of a different generation, that's what always happens, is that as you get older, you do tend to feel, I don't know about despairing, but perhaps a bit more critical of younger generations and thinking, oh, you know, it was better when I did it. Or I say this obviously as a very, very old man now.
I mean, I just turned 30, so you know how I feel. I'm absolutely scandalised by youth. Yeah, completely. I think it's interesting. There is a cliche to this, but it is, as our research has shown, and I shouted him out in our sort of intro episode, but a lot of this kind of historical context we're getting from Dominic Sandbrook, his 2 books. But it is true that there is a lot of just a greater kind of societal emphasis on sex, and that's something that Christie's reflecting, as you say, as part of her drive to kind of stay interested, stay curious, stay relevant.
Where does this fit in terms of wider society? And so how is sex part of the 60s society?
Particularly Sandbrook highlights the fact that although it's true that values were changing and there was a sense of permissiveness and a sense of freedom, I think it's also important to caveat that not everyone was kind of out in nightclubs, and, you know, the pill didn't actually change things overnight for everyone, and the decriminalisation of homosexuality in 67 didn't actually decriminalise it for everyone. And just, you know, those are all things that we'll touch on later, but just to kind of caveat up top. Having said that, we do see progress.
So when was sex invented, Gray?
In 1963, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP, famously.
I see. So they put the stork out of business.
Yes, exactly. That's Philip Larkin, isn't it? That poem, Annus Mirabilis. But it's true, there is a sense that there's another great history book that I referred to quite a lot, which is Juliet Nicholson's Frostquake, and her whole argument is that there's the big freeze, the winter of 62 to 63, and then as it thaws, what emerges from that thaw is this new liberated sense and this literal warming up of colder, stuffier values. And whilst, again, we should caveat that, there is definitely a sense in Christie's works of a similar kind of hotting up as the decade goes on, I would argue.
So it was interesting that when we were thinking about particular examples of this, both of us immediately thought about A Caribbean Mystery. A Caribbean Mystery is a Miss Marple novel about a murder on the fictional island of Saint Honoré from 1964. It's raised right at the beginning.
Yeah, a paragraph
in a few different ways, because there's a quote, isn't there, from the beginning? A really interesting little sort of insight into the way that Miss Marple sees sex in the world. Have you got it there?
Yes, so this is Raymond has packed her off with some modern novels, hasn't he? Her nephew Raymond, and she's reading one. It says Jane Marple had acquired quite a comprehensive knowledge of the facts of rural life. She had no urge to talk about them, far less to write about them, but she knew them. Plenty of sex, natural and unnatural. It's very much staking Miss Marple's claim to, okay, so she may be a quote-unquote spinster, but she does know about real life. Her whole canon of working out the solutions to these mystery puzzles is based on a knowledge of the community, right? Of
human nature.
Real people. Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting that we're now dragging that into the 60s, this permissive society. And Christie's kind of basically countering Philip Larkin. Sex wasn't invented in the 60s. Even Miss Marple knew about it.
Well, it's also interesting that she talks about these modern novels. She's writing modern novels.
Yeah.
she's writing in the 1960s about
There's
the
an
1960s. She's being absolutely explicit about the fact that these are set in the present day. And this is something we will come back to, I think. But people's vision of Agatha Christie is often skewed, as we said in the introduction episode, by adaptations that place so many stories in things like the 30s, 40s, 50s. Yeah. So it's really hard to remember that she is not taking Miss Marple from 1932 and sending her to 1932, but she's taking Miss Marple as she envisions this spinster figure in 1964.
From St Mary Meads, St Honoré.
Direct flight.
Yes,
that's from the new development at the edge of the village. These modern novels, though, are clearly not the sort of novels that Agatha Christie is writing. Because we get some descriptions about the sort of thing that Raymond's enjoying.
We get a brief passage. Yeah. So this is coming from the book that Marple is reading. Thanks, Raymond. Do you mean that you've had no sexual experience at all? Demanded the young man incredulously. At 19? But you must. It's vital. The girl hung her head unhappily. Her straight, greasy hair fell forward over her face. I know, she muttered, I know. He looked at her. Stained old jersey, the bare feet, the dirty toenails, the smell of rancid fat. It gets worse. He wondered why he found her so maddeningly attractive. And then Christie writes, Miss Marple wondered too.
She's so funny.
It's daring. She's hilarious. And this is another thing, as well as not acknowledging that Christie writes about sex, people don't widely acknowledge, I think, how funny she is. I know that's one of our enduring bugbears.
Yeah.
But there is this sense that in talking about sex more, so we've got sex as an element of these modern novels, both the ones that Christie is lampooning, but also, as you say, the one that she wrote herself. But we also have this idea of kind of pornographic material becoming more mainstream, and you were going to highlight The Clocks.
Yes, I love it.
The Clocks is a Poirot novel about espionage and an unidentified body from 1963.
And it's got all sorts of elements in it, but I love it really near the beginning that we get this little section where a typist is having to type up someone's bad pornography, which Agatha Christie calls it pornography. I'm not sure we would quite consider it as that. But I love the idea that Agatha Christie's actually sat down and said, right, this is what I think a bad pornographic novel sounds like.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that the typist is really bored and we just hear about her sort of sucking on her sweet or something while she's typing it up.
Yeah.
It's painstaking eroticism left her uninterested. This is Edna, the typist. She restores the toffee to the centre of her tongue. She sucks pleasurably at it and resumes her typing of naked love. Desire, this is Naked Love, so this is the pornographic novel as imagined by Agatha Christie. Desire had him in its grasp. With frenzied fingers, he tore the fragile chiffon from her breasts and forced her down on the soap.
My God. Do we need to put a warning on this episode? It's a lot, isn't it? Yeah. It's great. I remember, I think you sent me a message, like when we were reading for the podcast, going, Christie writes porn. And we never, because who's ever said that before? We never really, like, you don't think about it quite like that, but it's true. The fact that she thought to give us an insight there and is making it funny, but also holding a mirror up to society at that moment. And I love the fact that Edna's both completely nonplussed by what it is that she's having to type. It's just her job. It's just run of the mill. But she's also sucking on a sweet, which is kind of inadvertently seductive in itself, or certainly coded that way in literature and film. And there's even this sense that not just that Christie is bringing sex into her works and kind of more racy material, but that she has quite a full understanding of these things. Like you made the point when we talked about it before, that there's a kind of awareness of almost like the strata of pornography.
Oh, and like Cat Among the Pigeons. Cat Among the Pigeons is a Poirot novel about the murder of a games mistress at a girls' school from 1959. This idea that teenage girls in particular have this sort of growing sense of sexuality.
Yeah,
and
there
that
are
isn't to be
in the book.
and they're not to be neutered. Like they're not saying, oh, let's repress these girls, because it's a book that they find in a locker, isn't it? That seems to be mildly erotic in some, or erotic in some.
Nothing in the girls' lockers. Inspector Kelsey smiled. Well, this and that copy of a book, French, called Candide, with illustrations. Expensive book. Ah, said Miss Bulstrode. So that's where she keeps it. Miss Bulstrode says later, she won't come to harm with Candide. It's a classic. Some forms of pornography I do confiscate.
But it's around, so it's swimming around.
Yeah.
Meadowbank.
Oh, it's all Bulstrode does.
But if it's French and expensive, then that's fine.
Exactly, yeah. If it's got good literary merit, I think that's fair enough. I mean, yeah. It's the same thing you see in a contemporary novel, Prime Minister Brodie. I had to get a reference to Muriel Spark in there because she is my favourite. But this idea that this kind of adult sexualised world is swirling around and above the young girls' heads that they don't fully understand, but they just are sort of just slightly aware of or coming to terms with. There's also Passenger to Frankfurt. Passenger to Frankfurt is a standalone espionage thriller about Sir Stafford Nye's hunt for answers from 1970. And there's a moment where Lady Matilda, so the main character's great aunt, so she's very much a mouthpiece of that generation in the book, isn't she? And she has quite a few
acerbic asides.
Thank you. That's exactly the phrase I was looking for. Yeah, and some that aren't dissimilar to opinions that we know that Christie held as well. And there's a bit where she says, "When I was a girl, that's about the first taste of romance we got. Not pop singers or Beatles, just a romantic novel. We weren't allowed to read novels when I was young, not in the morning anyway. You could read them in the afternoon. You see, girls were supposed to be doing something useful, doing the flowers or cleaning the silver photograph frames." So again, it's very much imbuing an older character with import and agency in terms of their awareness of romance and sex, but it is also pointing out just how much has changed. A lot of conclusions are drawn from some of the opinions that Christie's characters hold, especially in the later books that are slightly more cantankerous or old-fashioned, that are immediately put in Christie's mouth. And I know that one of the things we're really keen to do is to sort of caveat when those are deliberately designed to be the opinions of someone else. And although we may know that Christie holds similar opinions, or we may have seen similar writings in her autobiography, which was also mostly written in the 60s, or certainly finished in the 60s.
65-ish.
That doesn't necessarily mean that we can just draw a straight line between the two. And actually that's doing a disservice to a writer who is incredibly nuanced and incredibly and contradictory, like we all are.
I mean, it's also, if you just think on a purely practical level, she's writing a novel a year pretty much at this point. How many characters are there? They're not all Agatha Christie, right? They just make for very, very dull novels. And I think that one reason why people sometimes assume that what's in her books represents what she thinks more often than perhaps it does, is because she gave very few interviews, and those that she did were very brief generally. And there are some really nice ones, and there's a fair bit of insight in her autobiography. But we don't really feel that we know her in a way that a modern writer, I think, who has to do the publicity circuit, who has to be on social media, who has to answer specific questions about every book that they do. I just don't get that with Agatha Christie. And I think that we have read enough of her interviews and autobiographies to at least get a sense of when the most obvious points are. But we don't know. We might sometimes think it feels like something Christie would or wouldn't have said, but there's no way to be completely sure unless she's specifically spoken about it elsewhere.
Yeah, there's all sorts of nuance that I think, we're hoping to bring to it with this discussion. So for those who don't know, Lady Chastity's Lover is an incredibly racy and daring novel that was written and originally published in the 20s and then kind of censored and banned. And what is interesting, what happens in the 60s is that the publisher is taken to court. So here from Dominic Sambrit, Never Had It So Good, having contravened the new Obscene Publications Act of 1959, so the same year that Cat Among the Pigeons was published. All that did, it sort of coincided with this amazing burst of popularity in paperbacks and this kind of wider democratization of reading, and suddenly kind of everyone on the train book stand and on their commute and going to the shops were clutching a copy of this book. But it's interesting that Christie is kind of reflecting the idea that obscenity is appearing in print and the impact that could have, and the way that's feeding in to more laissez-faire attitudes around sex.
Again, to go back to Cat Among the Pigeons, this sort of young women becoming more sexually aware, this is a really recurring thing. And she writes about them in a way that I found quite shocking now, to go back and reread that, in the way that she talks about several of the characters, because there's a whole discussion about the underclothing of one of the girls, and lots about whether they're bust bodice, and various discussions about their underwear, which really feels excessive to a modern reader. But the point she's making is that these are women, are young women, and they're not just to be considered as children. They're important to the story in their own way.
I think what she's doing there. So there's this character Shaista who's at the school and there's, as you say, there's kind of there's these lengthy discussions of what exactly she's wearing and how developed she is. That's the word that keeps coming up. I think it's actually quite a clever obfuscation, because I think you would be forgiven for initially thinking that Christie is just trying to be with the times by being more open about talking about, the sort of burgeoning sexuality of growing girls. But actually, it's not this kind of window dressing contemporary aside. It is actually a crucial clue that it's not that Shaista seems like she's a developed girl. She is, in fact, a woman posing as a student. And that's actually quite an important plot point. I think Christie's starting to play with our preconceptions, or a contemporary reader's preconceptions of what they might expect in a quote-unquote modern novel, and then use that to weave back into her mystery plot.
Because it's a really important, as you say, part of the mystery, as well as a significant character thing.
But I think it is important to say there is a problematic aspect to this kind of imposing of a sexuality on these young girls.
With the guy who goes undercover, I can't remember his name, but
Adam, when he's told he's going to this girls' school, he's told, if any oversexed teenagers make passes at you, heaven help you if you respond. I don't want you thrown out on your ear too soon, as in before finishing your mission.
But the fact he had to be told that's worrying.
It brings me in mind of something else that's going on at this time, which is really fascinating, which is the novel Lolita from the 50s, which is then famously made into a film, 62, I think, by Stanley Kubrick. And there's an amazing podcast all about this called the Lolita Cast, which is well worth a listen to, and they cover it way more comprehensively than we're going to have time to. But there's quite a lot in the various sources that we've read about the way that the actor playing Lolita, Sue Lyon, was both intensely sexualized, arguably to a point beyond the way that the book was legitimizing in terms of the press junket, in terms of actually what you see of her on screen. There are some horrible quotes I pulled out of a great book called Growing Up by Peter Doggett about sex in the 60s. He talks about the way that she was conflated with Lolita. At the 1962 premiere of Lolita, Sue Lyon, almost 16 at this point, photographers calling out Lolita, and she says, "I am not Lolita," and then walked inside. she was actually legally too young to see the movie that she'd starred in. It's this horrible kind of conflating of issues around that. And I think there is an awkwardness in society becoming more open and more liberal, which is, of course, in many ways a positive. What you also get is the prescription of sexuality on various members of society, including underage women. And actually there is something that we need to call out there. And it's something that some of Christie's works in the 60s do engage in, isn't it?
Because I was just thinking about in Halloween Party. Halloween Party is a Poirot mystery novel in which a girl is drowned while apple bobbing from 1969. There's this matter-of-fact way that Christie talks about. So the young girl, Joyce, who's murdered. All this discussion about, I mean, nobody seems to miss her very much. That's just slightly irrelevant to sex, but it means that the way they talk about her is as if she was an object, as if not as if she was a real girl, young woman.
They talk about her being, is she small for her age? Was she developed? Is she lumpy? All those kinds of words.
And there's this odd bit where one of the people investigating, I don't think it's Poirot, ends up saying how, oh, well, people often like the excitement of thinking there's a sexual element to the crime.
Yes.
You're like, this girl was just drowned a couple of days ago, and the way that it's spoken about is in this detached way. And we'll talk in a later episode about the way that Agatha Christie was quite cynical about society's changes and crimes, the type of crimes that were being committed in the 60s in particular. This is a really nonchalant discussion. There are those two teenage boys who talk about the murder and just sort of chat about, was it sexual, as if it's the most natural thing in the world and not a horrifying event.
I think Christie's doing something very clever there, which is, again, it's an obfuscation, because actually the reason, as it comes to it, the reason that she was murdered is not sexualized. And I think it's saying something about, it's saying two things. One, it's saying that people want to believe that it was some kind of sex maniac that wandered into the party. I think that's all, I'm almost quoting there. That's actually proposed as a theory, because they don't want to believe that someone they know could have done something like that. And that is a tale as old as time in terms of Christie, in terms of crime fiction, by saying, was it an outsider? No, the enemy is within. No, it was one of your family. Or no, plot twist, it was that character that you trusted all along. Fine, that's kind of part of the genre. And you're kind of given two options. One is that she's a kind of boastful liar, and one is that she was telling the truth about having seen a murder committed, and that's why she was killed. And actually, Christie's so clever because both are true. So there's Third Girl. Third Girl is a Poirot novel set in swinging London about a young woman who thinks she may have committed a murder from 1966. Christie's take on swinging London, isn't it? It's very, that's the one that we won't have to fight to argue is incredibly 60s. It's a world in which young women are moving out of their family homes and into these flat shares in London. The title literally says it. It's two girls looking for a third to fill a room and pay rent and get a job. And all of these aspects of that kind of life would have been unthinkable 20 years ago as something that was just done as standard. And Third Girl so heavily engages in, we see them in the kitchen having breakfast, and we see them going to coffee bars, and there's a real potent sense of teenage culture. Gone are the days where you would have to meet your beau at a coming out ball,
chaperoned by somebody, and set up. These are their own social spaces. This is where much more casual relationships of all types can start organically at these places.
Absolutely. And what comes hand in hand with the fact that they're more casual is that then women are in a position to instigate as well, which also ties into this kind of general relaxation in terms of sex and love. And for sure. And I think it is particularly interesting that it's not just a case of young women and now in the city. There's so much more than that in terms of so now they can bring suitors home. It's suddenly a lot more casual, and you get with that a sense of anonymity as well. There's an extra layer of suspicion, because it's like this girl was the titular Third Girl was kind of out in the city by herself, and I think there's a quote in the later Halloween Party about how there were kind of safeguards in the past to help look after like young impressionable people kind of first out and dating. And I think partly what Christie's doing with Third Girl is going, what if we take away those structures from before where your parents would introduce you to the parents of your potential beau or whatever it is, then maybe there's a danger and a tension she can play with that, and she uses that to funnel back into her murder mystery plot, which is actually a really smart use of contemporary goings on.
Yeah, because it means that it's inherent to the plot, like it's essential to the plot that it takes place in the 1960s.
Yeah.
But it's not just window dressing. It's not just casually mentioning people's fashions or whatever.
Yeah,
it's
completely.
saying this story has to take place here or it doesn't work.
Yeah. I think there's something literary going on, and it shouldn't be controversial to call Agatha Christie literary, but sadly I think it is in some circles. But we've got Third Girl, this incredibly snappy, almost Bondian kind of thrillery title, and we've got girl in the title, and we've got the first that amazing opener of the girl coming to Poirot, a young lady calling on Poirot. We're introduced to her as she's very of the moment, black high leather boots, white open work woolen stockings of a doubtful cleanliness. Christie always gets in a dig about how clean they are, doesn't she? So we've got that image against this is how Christie depicts him, the old male Poirot. And what does she say to him? She literally says to him, "Oh, I can't tell you about this because you're too old." Yeah. I think that's even how, if not how the chapter ends, that's like the key pivotal moment of that opening chapter, isn't it? And there are a few bits I noticed on my reread where Poirot later in the novel is kind of like, "Oh, les femmes," or there is a gender dichotomy, a gender essentialism to that book, which is clearly laid out by this opener of the young girl going to visit the older man. And it's even a thread that she returns to. There's that, I love the moment at the end where the girl says to Poirot, "I was rude the day I came here. When you were having breakfast, I said to you that you were too old to help me. That was a rude thing to say, and it wasn't true." And she kisses him, and it's kind of this like lovely kind of full circle moment.
This unwashed girl who kisses Poirot.
And Poirot goes, the book ends before Poirot can go, "Yuck,
absolutely,
get off
way.
me."
But yeah, because it works on both levels. As a reader in the 1960s, you're reminded that you're going to be aware that Poirot feels quite old-fashioned, just like any character who's been going for 40 plus years is going to feel like someone of a particular age. These characters only feel timeless once enough time has passed. Yeah. There's always that point that people become unfashionable. The characters become unfashionable, or writers, or films, whatever, that they suddenly seem a little bit embarrassing.
Yeah.
And I think the 60s is the point where Christie understands that Poirot is almost a little bit embarrassing perhaps to younger people because he's very much of his time.
Yeah.
Now we think of him as sort of timeless because we know his
because
story.
He's endured.
Because he's endured. Yeah, someone should write a book about him.
Yeah.
There's so much to say.
Go to all good retailers /Amazon /Waterstone / wherever you get your books from.
And buy 10 copies for all.
And buy 15 copies. Also, I mean, we said Third Girl is the swinging 60s Christie, undoubtedly. But we do get these little mentions of girls sharing flats and those kinds of behaviours in other books. We get it in The Clocks, we get it in Pale Horse. Mm-hmm. The Pale Horse is a standalone novel that explores mysterious goings-on and unexplained deaths at a countryside inn from 1961. Pale Horse is interesting because we quite early on we get this cat fight in the coffee house and one of the girls pulls out a clump of hair. We're invited, I think, to think that this is youth culture. This is 60s London. This is, and they're in Chelsea as well, which obviously becomes the fashion hothouse of London. But we're invited to think this is just their behaviour. But that's a crucial clue as well. The fact that she can so easily pull her hair out becomes crucial to the overarching plot. So again, we have this thing of Christie almost kidding us that she's doing 60s window dressing, but within that hiding some really smart plot elements, I think.
Absolutely, making us double guess ourselves.
Yeah.
And don't forget, these are short books. Like, by modern standards, these are really short books. And the amount that she manages to cram into them in terms of observations about society, characterisation, and weaving them into novels that have got at least a couple of murders in them, let's say. It's incredible that we can extract so much from them. and they still work on a purely plot basis as well.
Yeah,
They work. If you were to pick this on the shelf and had no idea when it was written, it absolutely works for you. You can still work it out. But if you know where it sits within the context of a career, and it's right in the 1960s, you read it in a slightly different way, I think. And you get a lot out of it, whichever way you pick.
Absolutely. But I think as well, part of the argument that we want to mount is that because I think there's a perception that genre novels are not smart enough to engage on this wider level with historical context and the kind of nuances and complexities within that. And actually by unlocking the reader's eyes to seeing all this incredible stuff that Christie's highlighting about the contemporary times, we're also then staking a claim to her being a much more sophisticated writer than the average person on the street might think. You're something of an adaptations expert, Agatha Christie on screen, famously.
Yes, famously.
Famously, it's a brilliant book. But there's an interesting thing in the adaptations in the 60s in terms of sex.
It's funny, actually, because it's not even just the adaptations. It's when she's away from the page, suddenly you're allowed to make it a little bit more sexy for sort of titillation reasons. So,
or even there's a feeling clearly from the producers that that's what Christie needs.
Yeah.
Which maybe is neglecting the fact that, as we've just been outlining, there is sex and there are elements of her books that are titillating or about love, romance, sex, whatever already.
Yeah.
But there's a perception that there's a lack and then they're injecting it in. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say. So I should give a bit of context to the ones I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
So there's actually her own stage play, which doesn't get spoken about much. It's a one-act play, Afternoon at the Seaside.
Afternoon at the Seaside is a one-act play, part of the Rule of Three collected plays, about the theft of an emerald necklace beside the seaside in 1962.
Which is, it's funny that it's sort of slightly bawdy. It's a bit end of the pier, I guess, which works because it's seaside. It's very light in lots of ways, and it was part of Rule of Three, which was 3 different one-act plays. But it's got this like ridiculous sequence where a woman gets undressed, and she even makes a point of the fact that this could be played up for laughs, that someone getting dressed just like you do at the seaside, you have to do that sort of shuffle with a towel around you. That could be played out for amusement. And there's no doubt that that's also meant to be funny because you're like, is she going to drop the towel? Or it plays with that fact that it's titillating, and that it's fun. So even Christie knew that once she went away from the page, that actually audiences rather than readers in the 60s perhaps were looking for a little bit more of that.
Yeah, maybe. But also there is a line that she has to toe, of course, because in the 60s we still have, up until 68, we still have heavy censorship of playwriting.
Yes, of course.
And actually Julius Green, who writes extensively on Christie in the theatre, does point out that there are quite a lot of censor interventions in Afternoon at the Seaside. Well, they allow, so I've got it here, they allow the word bastard.
Right.
If that's okay.
Like you went down your
I know,
quiet
I'm sorry to say that to you, Mark. I looked you dead in the eye and called you a bastard. I'm so sorry. But they did not allow, obviously, a homo, which was changed at first to obviously a queer, which was also vetoed. And then we ended up with obviously a bit feminine. But there is, so it's interesting that whilst being daring in one way that's clearly acceptable at the time in the theatrical world, there are other elements that she's being kind of fought on. I think that's a healthy reminder that a permissive, quote unquote, permissive society doesn't mean that it was a free-for-all, actually.
Yeah.
Got that same sense of you use the word bawdiness. So tell us about The Alphabet Murders. The Alphabet Murders is a loose adaptation of the Poirot mystery The ABC Murders, released in 1965 and starring Tony Randall as Poirot.
Okay, yes. Yeah, I feel like whenever I have to do a talk somewhere, I used to always bring this in because I know it could be guaranteed a laugh. So which is always what I'm searching for. But the first draft of the film was not the one that was made. Initially, it was... Thank God. It was supposed to be a sex comedy starring Zero Mostel, who's probably best known for being in The Producers now. And it was going to be a shabby girl chasing Poirot. And I haven't been able to locate a copy of the draft script, but what I do have are the American censor notes on the script. And they include things like that the script must remove visible evidence of Poirot's sexual excitement, and various scenes where he's so I think there's meant to be a scene where a young woman sort of rubs herself up against him in the lift. There's a sequence where he's buffeted by women's bottoms between them, where he's trying to lured into bed by a tall woman. Loads and loads of stuff like that. They sent this script to Agatha Christie. Can you imagine?
I hope she told them where to go.
She said, "I love it. Can we have this?"
She
of
did
course
not.
she didn't. she was actually very upset about it.
Yeah.
And Zero Mostel.
So he wasn't. Obviously, he wasn't cast. It was
No, it was Tony Randall. And Alphabet Murders doesn't have much in common with the ABC Murders, and it's definitely set in the 1960s.
I was going to say, because although thank God that first script is not made, the finished product is still. I think when I was watching it in preparation for this podcast, I was saying how basically awful I thought it was, and how kind of various settings didn't seem to make much sense. And I think you said to me that they had already booked all these locations for the kind of shabby sex comedy and then kind of had to make them work with a new script. There's a real disjointedness there.
There is. Certainly we know that the turnaround of this script they used was like a couple of weeks, was extremely fast. So that would seem to make sense. And there are still hints of it trying to be a bit like sort of titillating in a way, because the poster has got a leggy blonde, and it's actually one of the working titles was Amanda, who's the sort of one of the lead characters in the film, who may be a suspect, maybe a victim. Something seems to be going on with her. So this idea of beautiful women being a core part of the film is still retained.
You say in Agatha Christie on Screen that the original poster says it's really no mystery how this girl can be murder, with Anita Ekberg looking devastatingly gorgeous on the poster.
Yeah. But then also that is made after we've just had 4 Margaret Rutherford Miss Marple films, which couldn't be less sexy and couldn't really have less.
Oh, now come on.
But it's funny that they're very, very sort of picture postcards, Agatha Christie for American audiences. I always feel that they feel like they're very much idealised, old-fashioned, nostalgic.
Yeah.
They're not sexy films.
Alphabet's certainly more urbane, isn't it? Like, it's very.
Poirot goes bowling in a polo neck jumper.
It's so bad. And it's not a million miles away from. So we've also got the Disappearance of Mr. Davenheim. Hercule Poirot: The Disappearance of Mr. Davenham is a television pilot for a potential Poirot series starring Martin Gable, shown on CBS in 1962.
When MGM got a deal in 1960 to adapt Agatha Christie, they initially wanted to do TV more than anything. And this was their first go at doing TV, and they wanted to do a Poirot series. And they adapted The Disappearance of Mr. Davenheim, and it's an interesting 30-minute adaptation. I really enjoyed it, actually. Yeah, I mean, it works. But it was funny that I hadn't really thought about it until a colleague of mine at the time read my description of it in Agatha Christie on Screen, and where I talk about the fact that the premise for the show was that Poirot was going to drive around the country in this huge car that also has a bed in it and a TV and a phone and all of this sort of stuff. And he'd be in a different location each week and solve a crime. And she said, "Oh, so he's a playboy." I was like, oh my God, actually, that really is Playboy, isn't it? I literally have my bed with me.
I know, yeah. You have caveat this to me before, that you don't actually see the bed in the, because the Davenheim's essentially the pilot, isn't it?
Yes.
And you don't actually see
so the series Bible says that, that's how he's going to travel.
And you do get this sense that he is in this like Bondian car of amazing gadgets and stuff. And it's icky, and it's interesting that sex is brought into that. Why does he not just have gadgets that help him solve crimes? Why is there also this? But again, it's this sense of we have to sex up Christie. Either she's not doing it herself in her own novels, or she's not doing enough to interest us just in the source material, which I think is a completely erroneous claim.
Yeah, because it's there and important, but not necessarily titillating, and I think that's
in fact, I've got on screen up, and you say that in the trailer for Davenheim, Poirot himself was scripted to say of his creator Christie, her success has been achieved without sadism, and I admit this reluctantly as a Frenchman, without sex. There are two things wrong with that. As we've discovered, there is sex in Christie's, especially in her 60s, but also French.
I know.
We also have And Then There Were None.
Oh, which we love.
It's
This
so
is my
great.
favourite
65?
film of them. 65. And Then There Were None is a film adaptation of the titular story about a group of guests picked off one by one by a mysterious killer. This one's from 1965. Based on the play, actually, from the obviously very famous novel. So this is the second feature film version of the story. And the first was pretty traditional. But this one, it's really setting its stall out as being the mid-60s. So we have got this film that is absolutely saying, this isn't 1939 like the book, this is 1965, and we're going to make our characters relevant to 1965. But most obviously we get Shirley Eaton, Goldfinger's Shirley Eaton.
Yeah, so Goldfinger, this is 3 years before or something.
Yeah,
and she is the one that's, John Higgs makes the point in Love and Let Die, which is this amazing kind of exploration of Bond and the Beatles in the 60s, well worth a read. He makes this point that that image of Shirley Eaton, gold, naked on the bed is probably the most iconic image of the entire kind of Bond franchise.
Yeah.
And the fact that we're importing all of those symbols into Christie is really significant, I think.
Yeah.
Especially because of the other casting.
Well, yeah, because we've got Shirley Eaton who's saying, look, I'm 1960s big screen. I am the symbol of the big screen, really, in the 1960s. And then we have Dahlia Lavi, though, who was an actor, but also a model, and very much is wearing fashion. And then I think
she's wearing fashion.
She's wearing fashion. Her hats, like everything, is about her hats.
Both her.
I think
and
I'm
Shirley.
really rude about her and on screen actually, because I say that she
quote.
struggles
The hands.
to compete with the hats that she wears. she is not a great actor.
That's
of her
so
time.
camp of you. No, I think she brings this kind of stillness and this, which contrasts.
We can all
nicely
do
with-
that.
Oh, come on.
Stand there and be shocked that a camera seems to be near you. I'm sorry, Dahlia Lavi. I apologise.
And we've got Hugh O'Brien's Lombard, who is also very much this contemporary kind of matinee idol figure, and we see him shirtless, and we see Shirley Eaton in her negligee, and it's very, I mean, given that this version of the story, as you said, based on the play, has the romantic ending, it is, the whole film is very sexually charged. It's very focused on their burgeoning relationship.
It is.
And in doing so, moving away from what arguably the more pertinent point of Christie's original novel was. So it's funny. So you made the point that there's nothing sexy about the Rutherford films. so we're going to talk about them more in a future episode. But the MGM deal sees 4 Miss Marple films in the early 60s starring Margaret Rutherford. So she's given this sidekick of Mr. Stringer, right? Mm-hmm. Who is played by her real-life husband, Stringer Davis. So we're explicitly invited to break the wall, I think, as viewers between that character and the actor, given that he has the same name. Yes. I think it's really significant that the filmmakers decided to give Marple, although it's a very platonic vibe between the two of them, they decided to give her a psychic that doesn't exist in the original source material, but also one that is explicitly linked to her husband, who we know as informed viewers is her husband. And yet Marple famously as a character is a spinster. And there's even a bit in Murder, She Said. Murder, She Said is a film adaptation of 450 from Paddington, and the first of 4 MGM films to star Margaret Rutherford as Miss Marple from 1961, where she says to him that she knows what being in the throes of connubial bliss looks like.
The police think I'm dotty. What? Apparently what I saw was a young man and woman in the throes of connubial bliss.
There is an interesting thing. They dance in that later film. They do the twist together in that later film.
And they actually have much more relaxed relationship as it goes through. It's funny because I was just thinking about the different types of female characters who we see. And we don't see this a lot on the page of Agatha Christie, but we watched Murder at the Gallup recently. We were at an event. Murder at the Gallup is a loose film adaptation of After the Funeral with Margaret Rutherford's Miss Marple from 1963. And I was saying earlier that there isn't a lot of sex in those films. And actually, Murder, she said, that is absolutely like the relationships in it are very old-fashioned and clandestine, sort of like, you know, just sort of, oh dear, you know, holding hands and we might get married one day.
The listener can't see this, but for the benefit, Mark is doing a beautiful kind of gesture with his hands. Kind of.
What we get though in Murder at the Gallup is we had this really interesting, much more sexual scenes, a bit of a femme fatale. So this character we see on cinema screens mostly of this seductive woman who's got a lot of power, who will twist men around her little finger. And we get that in Murder at the Gallup. So you can again pick up the basics of an Agatha Christie story and make it into something else and say, right, for this medium, you know, women, for example, they need to operate differently. So they do tend to be sexualized more, just as we were saying with And Then There Were None, on screen than perhaps Agatha Christie was doing in her novels.
Which leads us neatly on, actually,
to
marriage, love and marriage. So I guess the most interesting kind of contextual point that I wanted to pull out here is that you get in the 60s quite a few of these kind of, well, two in particular, famous kind of American dream, suburban family, nuclear family novels. So the two I'm thinking of in particular, one at the start of the decade and one at the end, we've got Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates, and then we've got Bullet Park by John Cheever, and both were immensely popular at the time, and both and made it across the Atlantic, and both highlight this, as I say, this kind of nuclear family, the importance of marriage and stability. And I think there is a backlash, whilst we've talked about all this kind of permissiveness and this bawdiness, and there is a backlash against that and a sense of re-establishing the firm foundation of a kind of traditional family at the time. I guess the most famous married couple that we see in Christie in the 60s is, of course, Tommy and Tuppence, who are returning detective figures of hers. So they investigate By the Pricking of My Thumbs. By the Pricking of My Thumbs sees Tommy and Tuppence return to investigate a mystery at a nursing home from 1968. So later in the decade, but they're shown still very much in love, still very much a kind of solid unit. And The Rats. The Rats is a one-act thriller play, part of The Rule of Three collected plays about a pair of lovers trapped in a flat from 1962. Essentially all about extramarital sex.
It is, yeah.
When you boil it down.
It's this sort of thrillery, slightly horror type mystery about people being in this flat and trying to work out, you know, are they going to escape? Have they trapped there? What's happened to bring them to this flat, basically?
Yeah.
And it's really creepy. And it is, extramarital sex is the most important element of that. There's this quote, how many men have you hopped into bed with? I should like to know. So this thing that inherently, see that as a problem. If you slept with anyone other than your husband, it seems like that's a problem, regardless of whether it was, you know, an affair or anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is with a backdrop of divorce becoming ubiquitous to some extent. You know, divorce rates rising massively.
Yes.
So there is a sense of trying to keep the nuclear family together. It really struck me that Passengers for Frankfurt ends, you know, we'll talk about it more in later episodes, but it's this globe-trotting, complex, nebulous, psychological thriller, spy thriller. And actually it all boils down to Christie's almost insistent to create a happy nuclear family based around the theme of benevolence or happiness or contentedness. And she's almost, you can almost feel her insistence to that is going to be the image she leaves us on after all this uncertainty and complexity. And I do think you can feel some of the anxieties of the age in that.
It's interesting, this thing about the married unit. If we think of Endless Night. Endless Night is a standalone psychological thriller in which young couple Michael and Ellie are menaced by unusual happenings from 1967. District, which is often held up as one of her masterpieces. Some people say it's her last masterpiece. I don't think that's quite right. But we're strong disagree.
They are all masterpieces in the 60s. That's why we're doing this
Absolutely.
podcast. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
They actually, Michael is dangerous when they get married. Like, actually, before they get married, Michael is just stringing along Ellie. But it's interesting that I don't think it's overreaching to read the relationship between Michael and the dying architect Santonix as a gay one, or at least in some sort of some sort of homoeroticism or something going on there in their relationship, which is much more convincing than any of the other relationships. And we get in the film adaptation, which is a little bit outside of because it's early 70s, but it's actually a little bit more explicit there, that there's a sequence where Michael gets really annoyed that he's being asked to take, when he's a driver, to take this rich businessman into the red light district, and he absolutely won't do it. In this distancing of himself from sort of heterosexual desire is even more explicit there, that he's more dangerous in the heterosexual relationship than he ever was outside of it.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think Endless Night is engaging in genre tropes and almost tricking you into thinking, until 2/3 of the way through, you could be forgiven for believing that it's actually just going to be a romance.
Yeah. This is the great trick of Endless Night, and the reason why I think some people don't get on with it, but a lot of people do, is that you don't know what the book is until really far the way through. You sort of think, what is this? And I think that affects adaptations actually more than the book, because the book is sort of a bit of a page turner anyway, because you know it's a really good, strong read. But if you watch a film, I think it's quite legitimate to get 2/3 of the way through and go, what's this all about? Are we just going to watch these people get married and just like occasionally a witch will pop up? Is that what we've got?
And warn that more dramatic things are on the
will
horizon.
happen in the last act.
But to be fair, I guess that's the genius of Endless Night, is that when the scales fall from your eyes, they fall so seismically that it kind of makes up for any kind of building. And speaking of nuclear family, we get that in the Clocks, don't we?
We do. We've got the Ramseys who pop up. They're not hugely significant characters in it, but they're a little insight into, I don't know that this is a mouthpiece for Agatha Christie, but this is clearly something that she has heard, I guess, somebody say, where we hear Mrs. Ramsey vaguely remembering a remark by a woman columnist who says, only 6 happy days in the year for a woman, the first and the last days of the holidays. How true that was. Oh my goodness, that's so sad. This idea that wives and mothers are perpetually downtrodden and that everyone else has the fun while they do all the work, which I'm not saying was particularly wrong, by the way, because I think that's probably true in many, many families. But that's quite a pessimistic view of the family unit, isn't it?
Well, I think that's a sobering reminder of the caveat that Sandbrook makes about, the 60s weren't swinging for everyone. It wasn't, all kind of pill taking and sex having for everyone. And there is still this sense. Yeah, I think that reads very much like Christie's read that in a magazine. Yeah. So beyond the kind of conventional family, we've got, and steady yourself, Mark, but we do have quite a few references to kind of unconventional families or children had out of wedlock, dare I say. I know there's a lovely little moment in The Pale Horse where Mark, the main character, is visiting the vicarage. He sort of wonders how many round-eyed girls had tearfully discovered themselves to be prospective mothers and had confided their troubles to Mrs. Dane Calthrop. And received, I'm quoting, and received sound, if not orthodox, advice. There is, again, Christie's quietly radical. There is this sense that she's not just holding the establishment line. I mean, I would argue that, if not always orthodox advice, suggests to me that the vicar's wife is advising them things that maybe a good Christian woman shouldn't be advising them.
And would be illegal at the time.
Yeah. So it's not until 1967 that we have the legalization of abortion. And until that point, I'm getting this from Sandbrook again, historians agree that there were at least 100,000 backstreet abortions and self-induced miscarriages a year in the decades beforehand. It's really stark, isn't it? Yeah. We do get these kinds of references from Christie. There's Miss Rich in Cat.
So this is a character who we learn towards the end of the book has gone abroad to have an illegitimate child. This thing about the shame, I guess, of being an unmarried mother. But what's interesting is the way that Miss Bulstrode, who's running the school and is a fairly formidable figure, is completely sympathetic to this and says, well, you haven't murdered anyone, have you? So you sort of fell in love
moment.
and he wasn't the marrying kind, and this is what happened. So a real shrug of the shoulders there. Which I mean,
we're told time and again in that book that Miss Bulstrode is she runs the school unconventionally, and I think Christie's really putting her money where her mouth is in that, which is maybe surprising for people that have slightly reductive or slightly negative views of Christie's politics. I think
we get other children who are born outside of marriage, don't we? The clocks, and I think
which
even
is crucial.
In Halloween Party, it's not explicitly made, but the way that we're told about a relationship at the end, that must also have a child who is born outside of marriage.
Yes, Miranda in Halloween Party is presumably born out of wedlock, although it's not made explicit, is it? Or maybe it is made explicit.
I don't know. I don't think it is, because I did look for it.
Yeah. I went away and the baby was born. I invented the story of a pilot husband who had a crash. Yeah, you get these mentions, and it's, again, we said it up the top. It's matter of fact. It's a fact of life. Christie is showing all walks of life, and often matter of factly, often non-judgmentally, I think. Yeah, we for some more kind of contextual background, we get the Divorce Reform Act in 1969, which basically removed the barriers to divorce that have been there specifically to inhibit women, let's be honest, and just made it much easier. And this is definitely something that is on the cards throughout the 60s. It's being spoken about, it's being campaigned for, and Christie's clearly reflecting that increasing propensity towards just different types of families, I think.
As a woman who did divorce at a time when that had real ramifications, because she divorced in 1928, I think.
Yeah.
When it was obviously very difficult to divorce in lots of ways anyway, but it meant that as a divorced woman, Lucy Worsley talks about this really interestingly, about actually some doors were closed to her. I think there was a club or a society that she couldn't go to as a divorced woman.
Well, she couldn't, am I right in saying she couldn't go with Rosalind to her coming out?
You're absolutely right. Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
Which is, I mean, I can't imagine how. I'd love to know if we've got anywhere how she felt about that. That must have been heartbreaking.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
and really hard for Rosalind as well. And we get quite a lot of mentions of divorce in The Mirror Crack from Side to Side, which kind of engages in, Hollywood actors. And
The Mirror Cracks from Side to Side is a Miss Marple novel about a poisoning at a film star's house. It's from 1962.
Specifically, the idea of having lots of husbands is equated to being a trait of a film star. Yeah, I mean, I'm quoting here, divorce, if I may say so, seems second nature to film stars. There is definitely a sense that, and, they're all hopped up on Carmo, a fictional drug. But it's funny also that Elizabeth Taylor is a person that they cast in the film, famous for her divorces. Yeah, that I hadn't thought of that, but that's very true. Yeah, no, absolutely. We mentioned it before, but on the topic of abortion, again, even though it's incredibly contentious and it's incredibly, it would have been incredibly verboten in many of Christie's kind of more conservative circles, but we do get these acknowledgements in these texts. There's in Star Over Bethlehem. Star Over Bethlehem is a lesser-known festive collection of stories and poems from 1965. If you haven't read Star Over Bethlehem, don't worry, you're not missing a big Christie mystery novel you think you've never read.
Yeah, okay.
But I thought you were going to say you're not missing much.
Well, there's some of it's really interesting.
It's fascinating.
It's one of the things that I was
atypical
most excited
for her.
about. Yeah. But it's a collection of short stories that sort of have a religious, sometimes a festive theme, sometimes just a slightly more moral theme, along with several of her poems. Depending on which edition you get, you might get all of them or most of them anyway. But yes, so this is the sort of questions of morality and the way that things might change and are changing crop up frequently in this book. I mean, one of the stories is set in the year 2000, despite coming out in the mid 1960s. So there's a lot to unpack from that. But yeah, what is it that's about abortion in that one? It's the water bus, the story, the water bus. And there's this amazing section. So I'll quote from it here. Her daily woman was sitting and sobbing. Never told me nothing. She didn't, not her own mum. Just goes off to this awful place. And how she heard about it, I don't know.
and this wicked woman did things to her, and it went septic, or whatever they call it, and they took her off to hospital, and she's lying there now, dying. Won't say who the man was, not even now. Terrible it is, my own daughter, such a pretty little girl she used to be. I suppose I ought to have looked after her better, been at home more in the evenings, found out what she was up to and who her friends were, but children don't like you poking your nose into their affairs nowadays, and I wanted to make a bit of extra money. It's really galling, and it's just a side character. It's an aside in the story.
Which we also get in at Bertram's Hotel, a side character, because there's the doctor.
At Bertram's Hotel is a Miss Marple novel set in a London hotel, which is not quite what it seems, from 1965.
And at one point, this canon disappears and he's reawakened somewhere else. He's been sort of coshed over the head, as occasionally happens in an Agatha Christie. But one of the doctors who sort of attends to him is not registered as a doctor anymore, because he was doing things for young women that he perhaps should not have been doing. And it's quite heavily implied that he was performing abortions on them. So this just one side character who's given loads of personality and characterization. Again, it's this matter-of-factness about the fact that Christie knows that this is going on.
Yeah, completely. It's a fact of life. But it's interestingly, not so much in Bertram's, but certainly in the Water Bus, it's explicitly linked to this feeling which we get in Third Girl as well, this idea that with your children out and about more, you're not able to look out for them. And I think it's interesting that Christie minds the kind of sadness and the drama for that, and is very sympathetic and very humane in those stories. And it would be really easy to dismiss her writing, to imagine Christie writing about something like abortion as being quite dismissive or quite scathing, but actually what we're talking about is illegal and harrowing, and it feels like it's depicted with incredible tact. So the 60s, obviously the decade in which second wave feminism is kind of really being put on the map, I think, in a big way. And we see that with a lot of female characters' agency in the 60s novels. Not to say that there aren't great examples of that in Christie's earlier works, but particularly in these books that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, but I think this is the real difficulty with talking about feminism in Agatha Christie, is that her saying I'm not a feminist, because I think, and we know, especially with her 20s books, that she gives actually women really, really strong roles, particularly they're adventurers, they're driving the story, they're not always motivated by men in relationships, so sometimes they can be. You're right in saying that often stories seem to end with wrapping things up nicely with a sort of traditional family unit or traditional heterosexual coupling. But so it always had existed. But our problem with talking about it is this thing that Agatha Christie saying I'm not a feminist.
Yeah, I mean, but also just because Christie would balk, I know, at the label doesn't mean that depictions of female characters are not incredibly either nuanced or strong or could have been potentially inspirational, and also that she engages in the things that feminism as a kind of public discourse is engaging with, things like the pill, contraception, women in the workplace, all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, I gave this talk a couple of years ago at Greenway, this little after dinner speech, and I dedicated it to why Agatha Christie's wrong when she says I'm not a feminist, and listed all the things she's done. So I mean, I think she's wrong, but the reason why she would say I'm not a feminist in the 60s is because she, I think, was seeing feminism as this radical protest, which she was conservative in lots of ways, not in every way, but in quite a few ways. And protests were something that she had a real bee in her bonnet about. So I think anything that was designed to upset the status quo in that sort of a way is something that she naturally gravitated away from. Or
but having said that, we've got Tuppence taking a really leading, I mean, as she does in most, if not all, of the Tommy and Tuppence novels, we've got Tuppence taking a very kind of powerful leading stance in Pricking of My Thumbs. There are whole sections. I think the best sections of those books are the ones where Tuppence goes off and Tommy is lying unconscious
Always
somewhere.
want to skip the Tommy bits, don't you? Like, just get straight back to Tuppence and hope he's called away on business for a while.
Exactly. And we've got Ellie in Endless Night.
It's interesting because Ellie's a younger woman And of course, got lots of American money behind her, as we hear a lot from people.
Well, same. I mean, don't you?
Oh, I know. Yes, that's bankrolling this podcast.
You weren't supposed to say that on mic, Mark.
goodness.
You weren't supposed to admit that.
Conspiracy theories. But what I think is quite interesting about Tuppence is that she's allowed to age, right? Tommy and Tuppence are allowed to age. So Miss Marple and Poirot aren't really allowed to age. They can get a little bit older, but they're obviously sort of retired to begin with. But Tuppence is allowed to now be middle-aged, if not, Tuppence doesn't lose her agency when that youth drive may have deserted her. But she's got children, she's settled in her marriage, but she's still allowed to be an adventurer and to run that story.
She's a wife and mother, but actually for the duration of the novel, she does very little wifely stuff and mothery stuff and spends it all adventuring and investigating and and we have the three witches in Pale Horse, which are obviously incredibly central to that plot. And I think, again, they're depicted with a lot of dynamism and levels there in a way that witches historically, culturally have been sort of reductively painted or just dismissed as like weird old women. I mean, actually, the twist of the novel, I guess, is that they're not really witches. And I guess that in itself is giving them another level. Actually, I think you could make the argument that she's playing with something that could have been a misogynistic trope really sophisticatedly. And of course, Pale Horse is Ariadne Oliver's only Poirot-less appearance, am I right in saying?
In a novel, she pops up with Parker Pine once or twice.
Oh, of course she does.
But yes.
But I mean, I think having the confidence that Ariadne Oliver's a brilliant character, isn't she? She's got so much agency, and like Tuppence in Pale Horse, she goes out on her own and investigates that novel without the kind of crutch of Poirot.
And Ariadne Oliver, obviously being a mystery writer and in many ways representing lots of Agatha Christie's thoughts, and she was much more open about this. She says in one of her interviews, I don't know why people think I'm like Miss Marple, I'm much more like Ariadne Oliver. So that's not us inferring from it.
And another great example is Bess Sedgwick, who I think we'll end up talking about in greater depth in a future episode. But she's the
adventurer, I always think of her
as. I was going to say she's the villain of Bertram's, but she's kind of actually not. I mean, she isn't actually.
No, she isn't.
It's the twist. But yeah, she is an adventurer. She's a criminal mastermind. Is it fair to say?
Yeah, I suppose it's how you want to define villain, how narrowly you want to say it. She does lots of morally dubious and questionable things because she wants to have fun, right? She's eaten up and spat out loads of husbands.
Yeah. There's a great passage, isn't there, that sort of lists all the adventures that she's had, and it's very vibrant. And again, it's this sense of this strong kind of female agency that really permeates the texts. Bess, among other things, had driven racing cars. She'd saved 2 children from a burning house. She'd had several marriages to her credit and discredit, and was said to be the second best dressed woman in Europe.
Second best?
Who was the first?
I know.
I think I was the first.
I know I was off saving children from burning houses.
Yes, and Laura Thompson, Christie biographer, makes this great point about, she actually compares Madge, Christie's older sister, to Bess Sedgwick, and Elvira, who's Bess's daughter, to Agatha. So she says she calls Madge impatient, adventurous, and compelling, whereas Agatha was Bess's daughter Elvira, quiet, compliant, and infinitely complex. There's a bit as well in the novel where Elvira and Bess are described as Bess is positive and Elvira's negative, I think is the quote. And they are sort of two sides of the same coin, but also, again, women are not just one thing. Female characters in this novel are not just one thing. They're allowed to be they're allowed to contain multitudes.
Yeah, that positive negative thing in relations is interesting, because I immediately thought of that there's a letter when they're setting up Agatha Christie Limited in the 50s where Agatha writes to, I think it's to Edmund Cork, her agent, where she says, I don't really understand the complexities of this deal, but I'm sure it'll work out. And I'm sure that Rosalind, her daughter, Agatha's daughter, will be sort of the constant break of pessimism on it. So maybe
that's a more pertinent comparison then is because they are mother and daughter, is Agatha and Rosalind. And actually towards the end, Chief Inspector Davy says of Bess, she's a woman in 1,000, one of the wild ones. And we should say that we'll go into this in a future episode. There's a lot more to say, I think, about Bess Sedgwick and the Great Train Robbery and the kind of spine of that book. I think there's a lot of conversation in the 60s around second wave feminism about the male sphere and the female sphere, and women being allowed into the male sphere, i.e. the workplace, and the desire by reactionaries to kind of keep those separate. And you get things like, I always think Cat Among the Pigeons is fascinating because it's a girls' school, it's explicitly a female space. And I think I'm right in saying about 2/3 of the way through the novel, you get this amazing moment where Julia literally runs from the female sphere, which is
Julia's one of the
pupils. Yeah, which is, and at the point that school is in chaos. It's in confusion. There's at least one murder by that point. There will be two. There may have even been two by that point. That nothing makes sense, and she literally runs from that sphere to Poirot's study and pulls him into the plot. And there's this incredible dichotomy, I think, that's set up there. And you get something similar with because people always slag off books late Poirot's like The Clocks for bringing Poirot in later on. Yeah. But actually, I think in both those examples, in both of those books, the moment in which he's brought into the plot is really striking. It's really interesting. You get a character, and I can almost feel as a reader my excitement as we build up through those pages to, we know he's going to appear because he's on the cover, so when's he going to crop up? I think that's actually something really clever that Christie starts engaging with her readers on that level. Not a mistake or not a symptom of growing tired of these characters necessarily, but actually. And as I say, in Cat Among the Pigeons, I think it's making, whether it means to or not, making a really sophisticated point about gender. I pulled out a bit from Caribbean Mystery. There's the poor Mr. Raphael's poor secretary, Esther Walters, who's very much put upon. He is quite vile to her, down to having a go at her for not doing enough work but sitting about sunning herself and showing off her legs. But it feels like Christie is very much setting up a thread with Esther. I think my takeaway actually when I went back to all of these books is that when Christie's engaging with the agency of female characters, it does feel like an engagement. It doesn't feel accidental or incidental. I think this is maybe one of those ways in which people underestimate Christie and her intelligence. But it becomes quite a thread with Esther. So we hear a lot about she's a good-looking girl, but not an atom of glamour. I'm quoting there, which also like atom, like. I don't know, that the use of that word, which feels very loaded in a different way in this decade for reasons we'll explore in later episodes, feels particularly striking, I think. But we hear a lot about she lacks the come hither in her eye,
which is Miss Marple's old that she uses that a few times to say that was the old-fashioned flirting, basically, when it didn't always have to be directly into sex. And that's it, isn't it? Yeah, she's saying that she's describing the ways that she would have heard women like Esther described in her past. Yeah, so things like no SA. I don't know what sex appeal.
No sex appeal. Is that what it stands for? Yeah. I think the argument that this thread is kind of very intentional is that it comes to a head when the scales fall from our eyes and we realise Tim Kendall is the culprit, and she rushes to him and she says something, and he says, "For God's sake, you damned bitch, shut up, can't you? Do you want to get me hanged? Shut up, I tell you. Shut that big, ugly mouth of yours." I'm so sorry, that felt like such a tirade, but I'm quoting verbatim. That's such striking, misogynistic and aggressive language that you don't see all the time in Christie. I think she's very she does use that stuff, but sparingly. Yeah, we get it in Endless Night. Actually, we uses some right near the end. Words towards the end.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about that when you get onto how much that feels like horror, actually. Because it's a real thing. Just wanted to pick up at this thing about being in the workplace, because Christie, who's writing her autobiography around this time, actually is very negative about women working, because she says that women have been taken for mugs. I think I always remember that because I'm mugs. I don't think of Christie using the word "you've been a mug," but that's how she describes it and says. I mean, she doesn't. I don't want to extrapolate from that. She's saying, "Oh well, women had it easy before." She certainly seems to think that working is not something that makes it a life easier for women. She doesn't seem to consider much about things like perhaps lots of women really would like to work and that don't want to do traditional at that point, like domestic chores and stuff and household stuff, as well as the economics of it. She almost rolls her eyes sometimes. She says, "Oh well, I suppose people have to work for the money." Yes, I'm sorry, we do.
Yeah, well, there's a in Laura Thompson, she pulls out that Italian magazine interview,
yes.
which she quotes. She's asked, how have women come to play a more active role in life? And she says, probably due to the foolishness of women relinquishing their position of privilege attained after many centuries of civilization. So yeah, I mean, she's certainly opinionated on the matter. I also wanted to pull out, there's a brilliant when in Mirror Cracked they're talking about Heather Bagcock, who is another memorable female character, maybe for the wrong reasons. Craddock is talking to the assistant commissioner about her, and he says bossy women, they describe her as bossy, and he says bossy women seldom get themselves murdered. It feels a little bit like Christie is accidentally anticipating the well-behaved women seldom make history quote, which is coming later. I mean, I'm joking. That's not until the next decade, but it's interesting that you can't say that Christie's not engaging with the discourse of the time. There's clearly this stuff in the air, and she's clearly talking about it.
Yeah, because her characters are very clearly gendered. Like, it's a really
There's
important
a gender
part
essentialism.
of,
Sure.
which I don't know is something that we see quite so much of now. But I think that's an integral part to what their characters are.
So we absolutely see feminism coming to the fore in terms of people's preoccupations throughout the 1960s. I definitely think this is reflected in Christie's work. We've got, I mean, even it changes a lot within the decade. By the end of the decade, we've got things like the big protests at the Miss World event I think it's in the Royal Albert Hall in 1969. By the end of the 60s, the pill is actually pretty widely available, whereas at the beginning, although it is available from earlier in the decade, the extent to which it actually changes normal women's lives is in question. And obviously by that point, as we said, we've had the Abortion Act, we've got more women coming into the workplace, we've got changing attitudes, a younger generation coming forth, fashion playing its part. You know, there is a real sense that we're on a kind of trajectory there.
So for our last section, we're going to turn to all things queer, and we're going to go back to a Caribbean mystery, which we opened with, because Caribbean mystery, right at the beginning, has an explicit mention of a gay character who we don't meet, annoyingly, but we are made aware of because whilst Miss Marple is travelling across the world, of course, somebody has to be looking after her house in St. Mary Mead. And so we hear from Raymond, who had dealt with everything, we are told. He had a friend who was writing a book and wanted a quiet place in the country. He'll look after the house all right, Raymond says. He's very house proud. He's a queer. I mean... Then he pauses, slightly embarrassed, and thinks, but surely even dear old Aunt Jane had heard of queers.
Wow.
We've got our now explicit mention of a character in the world of Agatha Christie.
It's quite incredible. I love that because I love that none of a Caribbean mystery could have happened if it weren't for that queer character looking after Marple's house.
And how much do you want to read the book that he's writing? Because I've gone to this St. Mary Mead, there are murders, everything, there are these mysteries, people coming and telling me these stories about stuff that's happened in their past.
Maybe Marple's thinking, I'd rather have taken that novel on holiday than the modern novels, the claptrap that Raymond sends me. Yeah. We should say that the kind of foundational study of queerness and Agatha Christie is Queering Agatha Christie by our friend Dr. Jamie Berntal. It's incredible. You must read. He specifically sets out his stall that he only goes up to 52, I think.
Yes, he does.
Isn't it? So,
which was, because we both remembered that it was really good. So we're waiting for the sequel.
Yes,
so Jamie, if you're listening.
But yeah, obviously the 60s are a fascinating decade in terms of LGBTQ plus rights. Obviously that's an anachronistic term that I'm putting there. But we have the Sexual Offences Act in 67, which partially decriminalised certain acts of homosexuality, aka in private between people over the age of 21, really only concerned with men. But that had been a long old fight even to get to that point, and it was linked to the Wolfenden Report and this campaigning that was going on within certain sections of politics about more liberal attitudes towards mentioning that actually a lot of discrimination, if anything, increased afterwards in terms of arrests increased afterwards, for example, and things like electroshock therapy was still being explored in the background, something that Peter Doggett talks about in Growing Up. So it's not all sunny. We have the tragic murder of Joe Orton, the playwright, at the hands of his partner as well. So it's very much gay is on the agenda.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. We'll come to her Agatha Christie in theatre later, but Joe Orton as a playwright is absolutely foundational in terms of the way that the 60s is turning types of theatre that because she saw almost everything at the theatre. And she lived down the road from one of the theatres, and she would go all the time when she was in London. So she was absolutely aware of these changes that were happening. And I can't let mention of Joe Orton go by without saying that, of course, Joe Orton went to prison for defacing library books under some ridiculous trumped-up charge, which clearly was because he was gay. Yeah. But one of those library books was The Secret of Chimneys.
Is that true? I didn't know
that is true. And I actually, right behind you, Gray, I actually bought a copy of the edition. There it is. The Agatha Christie of unfortunately not actually defaced.
Are you going to go through it and deface it?
I should go and find the pictures that he stuck on it and deface, because it's the cover that he defaced. But yeah, so that funny little overlap of the world of like Agatha Christie unwittingly being dragged into his sort of very 60s, very sort of upending society and doing new things by her being one of the books that he defaced. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And I don't think, I mean, certainly two of the Rule of Three, we talked about Afternoon at the Seaside earlier, but The Rat and The Patient, the other two one-act plays as part of that, quite daring, and they're not out of step with the sort of theatre that we're seeing in the 60s from the likes of Joe Orton. So she is clearly aware of this stuff. All of which is to say that Jane Marple was not unaware of queers, and neither, of course, is Agatha Christie. You wanted to pull out The Mirror Cracked.
Before I shout out again to the All About Agatha brilliant podcast, before I'd reread The Mirror Cracked, I heard Kemper talking about the use of the word willowy, and that willowy often using as a standard. And once you notice that and occasional other words that she uses, you're like, oh, what are you trying to say about this?
Isn't there a thing about like long fingers and like being good at playing piano? Being a man that's quite good at playing piano? Isn't that a queer coding as well?
Is it?
I think so.
Yeah, okay.
We'll check.
No,
I think you're right. I think you're right to make that distinction. Although, like, I think Christie is not doing anything unusual for a writer of that era to be coding characters in a certain way rather than explicitly saying it. And obviously a lot of that is a lot of queer theory and scholarship that's gone on in the years since, which is arguably kind of imposing a reading on some of those characters. But that's all part of the fun. That's still very much part of this, isn't it?
There's also this interesting bit in The Mirror Crack from Side to Side, which doesn't really go anywhere, where Miss Marple talks to one character and says about his past in a way that, for me, reads as if she's saying, I know that you're gay, and that this is something that doesn't necessarily lead to happiness, or can often not lead to happiness.
So this is Hayley Preston, is it?
Yes, that's it. So she said that he reminds her of someone else that she knew who had an unfortunate past, and she won't repeat it. He didn't like it talked about. But this really sets a bit of unease for Hayley, it seems, in sort of response to that. So again, it's strange that this sort of goes nowhere, but there's a little bit of extra characterization there that she's dropped in, perhaps to represent a more diverse group of characters and having a group of people that are perhaps identifiable by.
Yeah, and like we said earlier, holding a mirror up to the real world.
So we mentioned the rats, and that's another example of a character who was so strongly coded as gay, and not in a sort of flippant way, but in a way that you're supposed to perceive something about his character. So it's this character called Alec, who we're told, I mean, it's not coding. We're told that he's the pansy type, very elegant, amusing, inclined to be spiteful. So I'm not going to say whether that's a gay cliche or not, but it's shorthand, isn't it, to say this is the sort of person who you might, just like you might say about a bullying schoolmistress or something, and you're immediately working out what that's meant. And she's saying, oh, this is a spiteful, what she calls pansy type character. So again, someone you can imagine maybe she's met at a party or that she's seen at something, who she seems to resonate as a type with her. Like I say, it's actually important to the characters. So we learned that Alec was devoted to the first husband of one of the other characters. Real sort of a cat on a hot tin roof thing. It really reminds me of that. This sort of simmering in the background about something that may have happened in the past. But it becomes really, really important to the way that the story develops. Yeah, you've only got to take one look at Alec to see what kind of devotion that was, we're told. So this, I think it's a real shame that Rule of Three, those three plays are not performed very often.
They're actually brilliant, aren't they?
They're really good, and they're really 60s. You know, they're really of their era in a way that I think would surprise people. Maybe that's why they're not performed.
Maybe more, well, certainly more crucial to the plot, certainly more central. I think one of the most fascinating in this area is the character of Michael Garfield in Halloween Party. And actually Jamie talks about Poirot respecting and admiring male beauty in his studies. And that's something we very much get with Poirot and Michael Garfield, especially I'm thinking of the beautiful sequence where he kind of comes upon him for the first time in the picturesque sort of quarry garden. Is that right?
Yeah, is it Sunken Garden? Is
the
that
Sunken Garden? Yeah, and it's described so anyone that doubts Christie's prose, like, look at those sections because it's beautifully detailed in its description. Yeah, I've got a bit of a quote here. He's standing near a musical stream that flowed down from above. Poirot forgot his feet, forgot the pains and ills of the human body, and concentrated again on the beauty that human beings could attain. He's standing in front of Michael Garfield, but also Miranda Butler, a very beautiful young man. He found it difficult to know whether he himself liked Michael Garfield or not. It is always difficult to know if you like anyone beautiful.
Wow. Yeah. It's a pretty queer book, Halloween Party. I think a lot of the reason for that is because we're dealing with so many younger people at the end of the 1960s, and their casualness to it is something that quite often flags up things like these changes in society that are much more open about these questions. So the two teenage boys that I've mentioned before, but they give us a little insight because Poirot asks them about a particular schoolmistress, and they sort of describe her, and then they like ask each other and say, lesbian? Oh, I shouldn't be surprised. It's just like, and Poirot's sort of like, oh, thank you, you've given me a lot to think about.
That's the way the section ends, isn't it? Which is really, it's almost like a comedy punchline. It's really well crafted, that whole sequence. It's significant as well that I think Poirot spends a lot of Halloween Party being captivated or kind of entranced by Michael Garfield and to some extent Miranda, understanding their significance but not quite knowing why. And obviously it becomes apparent that certainly Michael Garfield's significance is because he is 50% of the culprits. But the coda that we get to that kind of arc in the novel is Poirot kind of restating his values a bit at the end. He says to him, you want beauty at any price, but for me, it is the truth that I want. And it's sort of who would have thought that in such a late novel, Christie would be re-establishing who Poirot is and what he's looking for. It's a really interesting little character moment for him, I think.
We also see Cat Among the Pigeons, as we were saying, and they've spoken about the girls, but the teachers are also quite important to this because there's this thing about Miss Springer, who's one of the victims. When Poirot's trying to find out why she might have gone to a particular place, he asks, might she have gone to meet a man? And people laugh at the idea. It seems absolutely ridiculous that she would have gone to meet a man.
Yeah.
So there's this very casual thing about this. It's again like a cliche that a games mistress might be a lesbian. We've got this absolutely here. That seems to be the way that people are interpreting it in Cat Among the Pigeons.
I mean, unfortunately, she is, of course, the first victim. So we do also get another cliche, which is killing the gays.
Gay characters.
But yeah, and there's also, I'm sure there's a kind of there's a lot of lesbian subtext to Cat Among the Pigeons, partly, I guess, helped by the fact that it's almost an entirely female cast and the girls' school sort of setting lends it to it. But there's definitely an intimacy between Chaddy, Miss Chadwick, and Miss Bulstrode, the head mistress. Yeah. And I think you see a real... It's really galling. It's really heartbreaking when Chaddy dies. We may take issue with Christie sort of falling into the killing you gays trap with the games mistress, but there is a heart to the intimacy between Chaddy and Bulstrode that I think, well, it earns her a bit more queer representation brownie points, arguably.
Do we think Agatha Christie's camp in this decade?
Agatha Christie is always camp, Mark, you know that.
I know that she is, but it's funny that when we see things like those Margaret Rutherford films, right in the middle of the 60s, so outrageously camp in so many ways, including Rutherford herself is just camp.
God, yeah. They're having a whale of a time making them.
They're having so much fun.
Yeah. And there's a knowingness which is crucial to camp.
Yeah, she's sticking her tongue out and looking at children.
I love that bit.
And then she's like, Mr. Stringer helps her over a wall by giving her a leg up and all this ridiculous physical comedy. I was struck by watching Murder Ahoy. Murder Ahoy is an original Miss Marple film starring Margaret Rutherford from 1964. And that's really camp. That's set, as the title indicates, on a ship, and there's not necessarily homoeroticism in it, but quite a lot of just campness. Like our captain, played by Lionel Jeffries, is the captain.
Yes,
and he is the only person, I think, in the whole of those Miss Marple movies that goes, I am not going to be upstaged by Margaret Rutherford. Yeah. I'm going to throw everything at this and people are going to remember I was in this damn film. And you definitely do, right?
They hang such a lantern on it. There's the bit where, I've got the quote here, so there's talk of hanky-panky between the sexes on his ship, and he says, "It is a golden rule upon trust, and we are bound to uphold it. By thunder, you've got some explaining to do. Engaged to a woman? Explain, sir!"
So it's between the sexes that's a problem. It's like, if you're allowed to have hanky-panky...
I didn't even think of that, but you're right.
But only...
I'm struck through all of this. I mean, all of these examples are so fascinating, and I think... In the kind of contextual research I was doing, I rediscovered that quote from contemporary of Christie's Ian Fleming, author of James Bond, of course, who talks about the Bond books being written for warm-blooded heterosexuals, which is obviously a intensely irritating and problematic point from him. But if I may be so bold, I would say that Christie's books are very much not exclusively written for warm-blooded heterosexuals. I think there's a lot that a camp seeker and a queer reader can find and enjoy in particularly these 60s examples that we've outlined. Okay, yeah, so next episode we're rocking and we're rolling. We're going to look at the ways in which Christie brings modern music into her 60s writings.
So if you've got anything you wanted to add or anything you wanted to discuss about what we've mentioned in this week's episode, do get in touch. You can get hold of us on Twitter or X at Christie_time, the same on Instagram and Threads. You can also email us at theswingingchristies@gmail.com. We've got our own Twitters as well, tweets. So I'm at Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray is at classic_Graham. Also, there are nice links in the description if you want to perhaps find out some more about what we've been discussing today. So links to my books about Poirot and the forthcoming one about Marple.
Yep, get your pre-order in.
Please, my publisher's relying on it.
Thanks for listening, you sexy beasts. The Swinging Christies is a Christie Time project by Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown. This episode was recorded on the 3rd of November 2023. Our artwork was designed by Bartlett Studio and our music is by Darg Golan. Peace out.
Also, I want to do a thanks.
Yes, special shout out
to Fred Connolly, who's at Brendan Connolly on Twitter. I can't X. But Frederick Brendan was the first person, I think, to suggest a version of the Swinging Christies title.
Yeah, so you tweeted something like, why do people not talk about this more?
Yeah, exactly. And Frederick Brendan tweeted almost instantly to say, how about something like Swinging Christies? And actually, no, don't use that, or something along those lines. I was like, no, thank you, I'll take that. And so
He said, don't use that.
yes,
Oh, no.
he did. I know, I have got permission since, so we haven't just
No,
taken
as in
it.
like, because
As in,
he thought
it's
it was
terrible.
naff.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, no.
Sorry, Brendan.
One person's naff is my
Fred.
brilliance.
Oh, well, look, we wouldn't be here right now without Fred/Brendan, so that's amazing.
It's amazing though, because you say that name and people laugh immediately. And for me, I'm always looking for the joke.
Yeah,
it's terrible, isn't it?
When I was looking at what we could call if we do bonus episodes, and I was like, should they be called Boys Keep Swinging, : and then the episode title?
We'll wait and see.
Oh, God.